Today I will show you the real heroes of the bloodiest war of the 21st century, which could escalate into World War III, since Putin's ambitions know no bounds. Every dictator has those who carry out criminal orders. Today I will introduce you to those whom Putin says are the future of Russia, the people who, according to his plans, will rule over ordinary Russians. Well, are you ready? This is going to be something. I combined all the episodes about these heroes into one. I'm Semyon, and this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. The first story, Orthodox. Adam Sherbakov from Bryansk had a tendency toward a criminal life since childhood, and at the age of 17 he received a suspended sentence for theft. And in 2018 he attacked a girl, beat her with a metal rod, and took her bag. For this, he was sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in a maximum security penal colony. But already in the summer of 2023, the former convict became a hero of modern Russia by signing a contract and joining the ranks of Storm Z. He is Z, one of tens of thousands of such criminals. However, Sherbakov could not withstand the hardships of military life. And after just a few months of service, he deserted from near Avdiivka. Sherbakov fled far behind the front lines and settled in Domodedovo, near Moscow. And as expected, he quickly ran out of money. The deserter decided to get some the old-fashioned way. He asked a resident of the city of Vidnoye, a local pensioner named Roman Legoida, for a ride, and on the way, he robbed and killed him. He got 100,000 rubles and dumped the body in a local ravine. But the victim turned out to be not just some ordinary old man from the Moscow suburbs, but the father of Vladimir Legoida, who was serving as the press secretary for Patriarch Kirill. That is, he was in charge of this entire disgusting propaganda machine of the Russian Orthodox Church. Given such strong pressure from above, the police found the killer the very next day, December 29, 2023. There hasn't been a trial yet, so we can only guess about the punishment. However, what's the irony in this crime? The father of Vladimir Legoida, who called for the killing of fellow Orthodox Christians from Ukraine, fell at the hands of someone who was actually involved in those killings. It's just the irony of fate, nothing more. Story number 2, a similar pattern. They say that handwriting developed at an early age hardly changes throughout life. Experienced forensic investigators say the same thing about criminals. Once they've committed a crime, they'll commit the next ones in almost exactly the same way. This folk wisdom was confirmed by the actions of the next Russian hero, a resident of Rostov-on-Don, Sergei Rudenko. In October 2017, he committed his first crime. He killed his partner. During a heated family quarrel, Rudenko knocked her to the floor and strangled her with a bathrobe belt. And then he tried to stage her suicide, making it look like a hanging. However, the investigators didn't believe this act, and the murderer was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he only served half of his sentence before leaving to fight in Ukraine as a mercenary for the Wagner PMC. We don't know anything about Rudenko's combat exploits, but we do know for sure that in the spring of 2023, he returned from the front and started looking for housing in his hometown. He found a suitable option through an ad and arranged to meet with a 52-year-old woman from Rostov to rent her apartment. But during the apartment viewing, Rudenko and the landlady argued over the rental price. That's when the former Wagner member remembered his half-forgotten skills, and he strangled the woman with a fabric cord, and also inflicted multiple stab wounds to her neck. The woman died at the scene from her injuries. Then he took the victim's phone and fled the crime scene. But the very next day, he ended up behind bars. Already in September 2023, the murderer stood trial and was sentenced to 11.5 years in a high-security prison. Unless he ends up on the front lines again. In a fake tough guy state like the Russian Federation, you can expect anything. The third story, Burn, Burn My Sister. A resident of the Nizhny Novgorod region, Oleg Grechko can safely be called a real thug. He spent most of his not-so-heroic life behind bars. The last time he was convicted was in March 2022. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison for the murder of his acquaintance, whom he stabbed at least 12 times. After that, he strangled him with a wire from an immersion heater. Quite a start, isn't it? But the most interesting thing happened a year later. Responding to the call of the good Orthodox Tsar, Grechko received the necessary pardon and joined the ranks of Prigozhin's warriors. He took part in the famous local assaults near Bakhmut and, most importantly, survived. In the summer of 2023, his 6-month contract ended, and he had the opportunity to return home. And right away, the former Wagner fighter showed his true colors. He was charged with assault and theft. The police delayed accepting the victim's complaint, saying they wanted to understand and help the hero of the special military operation. In other words, they simply didn't want to get involved with such a hardened criminal, and the case was quietly swept under the rug. Sensing his impunity, Grechko decided not to stop. And that's not surprising, because for such a hero, as they say, all doors are open. And already on September 28, 2023, he killed his own sister during an argument with whom he was living in the same apartment. But he didn't just kill her, he burned her. Yes, you heard that right. He actually burned her alive. He poured gasoline on his own sister and set her on fire. The woman died instantly from the burns she received. At the same time, the arsonist himself suffered significant burns and even ended up in the hospital. This truly barbaric act received widespread public attention. Even Putin's loyal watchdog, the Investigative Committee of Russia, got involved. And that means Grechko will go to jail for a long time, or maybe he already has. So, a leopard can't change its spots. Apparently, he's destined to end his days in prison, and no special military operation helped the criminal become a normal member of society. If anything, it was quite the opposite. The fourth story, another arsonist. Probably very soon, for Wagner fighters, it'll soon become standard practice to set fire to anyone they don't like, or to someone who said something wrong. But our new hero didn't set his own sister on fire, but his neighbor. Actually, 2 neighbors. Otherwise, the situation is painfully familiar, but no less horrifying because of it. A resident of the village of Yarmakovskoye in the Krasnoyarsk region, Denis Stepanov, ended up in prison in 2021 for 3.5 years. While in a rage, he beat an acquaintance with a metal stove damper. And then, as usual, recruitment Prigozhin style, a 6-month contract, war in the Donetsk steppes, injuries, and return home. But Stepanov didn't boast about his combat exploits for long. He got into a conflict with a neighboring family, a 68-year-old woman and her 35-year-old daughter. He threatened them more than once. And at the same time, he was causing trouble, arguing with many of his fellow villagers. No one could say a kind word about him, that's for sure. But let's get back to the crime itself. On the night of October 3rd, 2023, Stepanov deliberately waited until the women were sound asleep. He doused their wooden house with gasoline and set it on fire. The victims burned alive, not even having time to get out of their own beds. The hero of the so-called special military operation was caught red-handed. Especially since the killer didn't even try to deny anything. Disarming honesty, that's all there is to it. Story 5. And this creepy story is quite recent. It hasn't even had time to gather a thin layer of dust yet. A native of the Zabaikalsky region, TSRN Darji TSRN Zhapov, committed a truly terrible crime back in October 2019. He strangled and dismembered an 18-year-old girl. Then he dumped her remains in the river. The killer was caught and, as expected, got a lengthy prison sentence. 14 years in a high-security penal colony. Like thousands of others, TSRN Zhapov was swayed by the sweet talk of Prigozhin and his lackeys. And, as expected, he joined the ranks of Wagner. Almost nothing is known about his combat exploits. However, after serving the required 6 months, he returned home, back to his native Zabaikalsky Krai. And right away, he started acting like a hero in a big way. First, he visited his ex-wife, who already had a new family by then, and heroically beat her up. In fact, he beat her up badly, because the woman ended up with shattered eye sockets, and that's why she had to have titanium plates put in. You can't imagine the extent to which the police don't want to open cases against those who returned from the war. It's the same thing here. For a very long time, they didn't want to open a criminal case. The valiant Russian law enforcement bravely dispersed protesters against Putin and his regime. However, for some reason, they're not in a hurry to deal with former Wagner members. However, the victim eventually got her way, and the case was sent to court. But the result was close to zero. Tsirinjapov showed his medals and talked about how bravely he shed blood for Russia in Ukraine. And he got off with a ridiculous fine of 5,000 rubles. That's what the most humane court in the world looks like. The late Navalny and other political prisoners can't truly appreciate such kindness. But Tsirinjapov's heroics didn't end there. He decided to raise the stakes. And in September 2023, during an argument, he strangled a 22-year-old woman. This time, he didn't dismember the victim's body, but simply carried it out to the nearest grove. This time, the police didn't mess up, since the case was just too outrageous. And on March 4 of this year, the District Court of the city of Chita sentenced the hero of the special military operation to the already familiar term of 14 years in prison. And also to 2 million rubles in compensation for moral damages in favor of the murdered woman's relative. Honestly, it's hard for me even on a moral level to make videos like this. And these inhumans commit murders and consider it a normal part of everyday life. Story 6. Killed in return for shelter. A vivid example of true Russian heroism is Ivan Rosomakin. In his native village of Novi Burets in the Kirov region, even as a very young man, Ivan had already become famous back in 2015. 10-year-old Ivan, while drunk, broke into a neighbor's house and tried to strangle the owner. For this, drumroll please, he was sent to jail for 2 weeks. A year later, he robbed a local store, got drunk, and hit an acquaintance with a shovel. For all these crimes combined, he received 3 years. Rosomakin was released in May 2019, but he didn't stay free for long. Ivan started his usual day with a bottle of vodka, but drinking alone was boring, so he went to his friend's place. To get there faster, he decided to climb over his neighbor's fence. She protested, and for that, he simply beat her to death. A few days later, he attacked another woman, beat her, and stole her bag, which had a bottle of milk and a loaf of bread in it. He was caught, and as a result, in 2020, the court sentenced him to 14 years in a maximum security penal colony. But Ivan didn't want to spend that much time in prison. Besides, he had no intention of changing his ways. Taking advantage of the magic key to freedom that Yevgeny Prigozhin offered to all prisoners, he enlisted in the Wagner PMC. He managed to survive the war, and at the end of March 2023, he returned home to Novi Burets. He was treated as a hero of the special military operation, which made him more aggressive and confident in his impunity. Life in the small village became truly Russian: drunken brawls, fights, and hooliganism. He chopped up a couple of cars with an axe, threatened his neighbors with a pitchfork, and most horrifying of all, harassed women, and not with flowers. People became scared, so they flooded the local authorities with complaints, who even organized a village meeting to calm everyone down. The authorities considered expelling the unruly resident from the village so that he would go back to the war or somewhere else. But they didn't have time. At the time of the meeting, the troublemaker was serving 5 days in jail for petty hooliganism until March 27. And on the 28th, according to the head of police of the Vyatsko-Polyansky district, Vadim Varankin, he was supposed to leave somewhere by train with all his belongings. But something went wrong, and on March 29, Ivan Rosomakin committed another terrible crime. Being heavily intoxicated, the 28-year-old repeat offender broke into the house of his longtime acquaintance, 85-year-old Yulia Buiskik. She lived in the neighboring town of Vyatskie Polyani and always helped young people. In the early 2000s, the grandmother would take in children who studied at vocational schools but didn't live in the city, instead coming from villages in the area, particularly from Novi Burets, because sometimes it was impossible for them to get home. The transportation system of Great Russia. What else can I say? And one of those children she helped was Ivan Rosomakin. But on that March 29, he was no longer a youngster, but a hardened criminal and murderer who had long since tasted blood. Not satisfied with it in the war, he sought it in peacetime. The helpless old woman whom the ghoul came to, of course, couldn't resist him, and Rosomakin closed in on her. He stabbed her multiple times with a knife while simultaneously raping the old woman. On April 24, 2024, the court sentenced the murderer and rapist, as well as the hero of the special military operation, to 22 years in prison. Ivan hopes to go to war and then return to his homeland to the joy of his neighbors. Story 7. He loved her to death. This is the story of 51-year-old Sergei Mironov. In 2022, he was convicted of murder. Just like Rosomakin, he was recruited into the Wagner PMC. This happened in October 2022. He received a medal for bravery, which the former convict was very proud of, and posted photos of himself with it on social media. Sergei Mironov fought until April 2023, and as a reward for his service, he received a pardon from President Vladimir Putin. He went to Moscow as a great hero, and there, his personal life improved as well. A 42-year-old woman, let's call her Svetlana K., found a strong shoulder to lean on in Mironov and opened not only her heart, but also her home to him, which was located in the Bibirevo district on Konenkova Street. Their relationship became passionate, and their daily life was never dull. This is evidenced by the police reports that Svetlana periodically filed against her partner, backing up her complaints with bruises on her body. But as soon as Sergei sobered up and apologized, the woman's desire to punish her offender disappeared, and she withdrew her statements. And the brave soldier himself was not bored either, and was constantly looking for trouble. Because of this, he spent several months in a detention center for deliberately damaging someone else's property. But that was just the beginning. On Sunday, March 24, 2024, former convict and hero of the special military operation Sergei Mironov called the police and confessed that he had killed his common-law wife during the night. The officers who arrived at the address did indeed find the disfigured body of a woman at the scene. The man inflicted 15 stab wounds on his partner and, for some reason, also cut off her ear. The killer was never able to explain why he took his wife's life, nor why he needed her ear. He only remembered that before picking up the knife, he had drunk several bottles of vodka. The most terrifying thing is that all this horror happened practically in front of a 15-year-old girl, Svetlana's daughter, who was in the same apartment that fateful night. And it's unlikely that the arrest of her mother's killer will somehow improve the girl's emotional state. Story 8. A tough guy among sheep, but faced with a real tough guy, he's a sheep himself. Analyzing the details of the huge number of crimes that the so-called heroes of the special military operation managed to commit in such a short time, forgive my frankness, causes a feeling of disgust and revulsion. But I found something in common in all the cases. Almost always, these heroes look for victims who are significantly weaker than themselves, so they can once again prove how heroic they are by comparison. One of these victims was 38-year-old Saslan Valiev, a resident of Tskhinvali, the capital of the so-called self-proclaimed Republic of South Ossetia, which is in fact also a territory occupied by Russia. Saslan Valiev, better known in his city by the nickname Tsugri, was a local eccentric whom everyone in the area knew. The man had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy and was a completely harmless person who posed no threat to those around him. But for Russian heroes, it's important to show their strength, so former hero of the special military operation, Georgy Sukev, killed the unfortunate man right on the street on April 17, 2023. He started mocking Saslan, and when Saslan swore, Sukev, without thinking twice, stabbed the disabled man in the thigh. It should also be noted that the ambulance, which arrived to help, did not actually provide any help, excuse the tautology. That's why Valiev lost a lot of blood and died in the hospital. Already in court, Sukev explained that the murder supposedly happened without malicious intent, that he was only trying to scare his offender with the knife. But for some reason, Valiev was not afraid of the knife and, after stepping aside, continued to swear, for which he was punished. Some sources claim that Georgy Sukev ended up with the Wagner group from a prison colony, where he was serving time for previous murders. In 2014, he went to Ukraine to fight as a volunteer, but something went wrong there, and he killed his commander, for which he was convicted. But Russian media prefer to keep quiet about this incident. It's kind of awkward to make heroes out of people who kill their own commanders. And now, attention, the court's decision. I really can't believe this is possible. The killer was given 4 years in prison. 4 years for an inhumane murder. Story 9. My debts are your problems. No matter how much you try to reform a criminal, he still wants to make easy money. That's exactly what happened in our next story. The biography of 36-year-old Rael Kairov, a resident of the Pavlovsky district in the Ulyanovsk region. This so-called hero of the special military operation is quite rich. But not because of military valor, because of heinous crimes. Barely having reached adulthood, Rael was sentenced to 7 years for attempted murder. He smashed a man's head with a crowbar. In 2018, Rael Kairov shot a man with a shotgun and burned his car along with the corpse. For this, he received 11 years and 8 months in a high-security prison. And he would have stayed there until the early 2030s if it weren't for the war in Ukraine. Kairov took advantage of this opportunity and went straight from the penal colony to fight in Ukraine as part of a PMC. Then, following the well-known scenario, he received a pardon from Vladimir Putin for participating in the special military operation. Upon returning to his hometown, he committed another crime. The former Wagner fighter didn't have enough money for a comfortable life, and he accumulated debts. When it was time to pay them off, he decided to fix his financial situation at someone else's expense. He chose his victim, a 46-year-old father of many children, a mosque servant named Ibrahim Yesenyaev from the Penza region. In his free time from serving God, this miracle happened. The man was engaged in buying animals for meat. At one time, even Kairov's relatives sold him livestock. He knew about this and he came up with a plan. On April 15, 2024, Kairov called his potential victim and offered to sell him a couple of bulls. But supposedly, they needed to go pick them up in the neighboring Saratov region. He introduced himself using a fake name. The next day, Ibrahim picked up the Wagner member in his car, and they set off on their journey. After driving with the supposed seller for more than 2 hours, Isenav started to suspect something was wrong. He took a photo of his companion and sent the picture to his acquaintances. But he never got a reply, because Kairov demanded that Ibrahim hand over the money he had set aside to buy the livestock, which of course he didn't want to give up. The so-called hero of the so-called special military operation, without thinking for long, stabbed the worker in the heart with a knife. After taking 300,000 rubles from the car, the killer made his way to his native village of Muratovka in the Ulyanovsk region. He got into his own Zhiguli and returned to the scene of the crime. There he moved the body of the victim into the trunk of his own car and set the Gazelle van on fire. Once in the Ulyanovsk region, Kairov dumped the corpse into the river. And what do you think were the next steps of our killer hero? That's right, he went to a place where he could hide, to the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, to sign up as a volunteer. But the man he killed, Ibrahim, was highly respected. That's why the crime caused a big stir. Law enforcement tracked down Kairov. In particular, thanks to a photo taken by the victim, they arrested him and brought him back to the Saratov region where the crime was committed. Now he faces life imprisonment. But for some reason, I feel like the hero will be sent to the front again, where his life sentence will end much sooner. Story 10. The Crime Gene. Vasily Murachev, a resident of Angarsk in the Irkutsk region, was always known for his criminal tendencies. So, in May 2016, Murachev was sentenced to 1 year of restriction of freedom for causing moderate bodily harm. And in 2017, he received another 15 days for causing minor bodily harm. Realizing that fighting doesn't put bread on the table, Vasily moved to a new level. In August 2018, as part of a local organized crime group and using fake documents, Vasily stole scrap non-ferrous metals worth about $100,000. For this, he was sentenced to 8 years. After that, everything followed the same scenario. Through Wagner and a personal pardon from Putin, he was released. But already on June 20, 2023, in one of the cafes in the city of Angarsk, he killed a person with a firearm. He also wounded 2 others. All of this happened in broad daylight, in the presence of women with small children. Story 11. He killed, dismembered the body and drank vodka. Alexei Serov was sentenced to 12 years in 2018 for causing serious injuries that resulted in death. But why serve such a long sentence if the state, represented by Putin, pardons you after 6 months spent in the special military operation zone? If you survive, of course. In October 2022, while serving time in a Udmurtia prison, Serov signed a contract with the Wagner private military company. And he went to serve in the so-called Special Operations Zone, which was started in Ukraine by Putin himself. And in July 2023, he was already granted a pardon. And with a clear conscience, as the newly minted heroes of the Special Military Operations say, he settled in the Toznensky district of the Leningrad region. He told everyone he came to earn money. But he wasn't in a hurry to get a job. The 42-year-old veteran of the Special Military Operation was living with 47-year-old Nadezhda Konyukova. On April 20th, Yulia Mukhturova went to the St. Petersburg police and reported the disappearance of her mother, Svetlana Konyukova. She was the twin sister of Nadezhda Konyukova. Together with her sister, she was registered at Komsomolskaya Street in the village of Nikolskoye. When the police came to the registered address of the missing woman on April 21, they rang the doorbell and knocked for a long time until a very drunk Serov finally opened the door. In the apartment, the law enforcement officers found a suitcase with packed human remains. Serov threw a second suitcase with the same contents out the window while the police were knocking and ringing the doorbell. The hero of the special military operation was so drunk that he couldn't even speak coherently. He couldn't utter a single clear word. After being detained and sobering up, the thug said that on April 16, a quarrel broke out between the sisters. Taking his girlfriend inside, Alexei strangled Svetlana. Then he went to the store, bought a saw and a suitcase to cover up the traces of the crime. He dismembered the body during breaks between drinking large amounts of vodka. That's why he was found in such an incoherent state. Story 12. 2 murders for failing to show proper respect. A prime example of Russia's future elite. He was found in distant Yakutia, in the village of Kutana. At the beginning of 2023, 35-year-old Viktor Savinov returned from Ukraine, but for some reason, the heroes of the special military operation were not welcomed in his own home. His father simply didn't let his son into his house, so he had to look for another place to live somewhere outside the village. I think the father knew something. And that something showed itself in 2 murders in a single day. On Defender of the Fatherland Day, that is, February 23rd, Viktor Savinov, of course, was celebrating. But obviously not very cheerfully, because he was walking around the village complaining about the lack of respect from his fellow villagers. With the same complaints, he went to his aunt, 64-year-old Valentina Fedorova. Since it was already around midnight, his aunt didn't let her nephew into her house, and she called the head of the village. That Viktor was drunk, wandering the streets and causing trouble. As a result, the local police officer arrived and took Savinov home. Perhaps if the law enforcement officer had detained the troublemaker, what happened wouldn't have occurred. Because the next day, Savinov first smashed the head of his drinking companion, a 34-year-old man. And then he went to Valentina Fedorova to take revenge for yesterday's call to the chairman. Driven by a deep sense of resentment for being undervalued in society, the killer struck the woman with an axe for his own satisfaction. After that, he tried to set the house on fire and fled the scene of the crime. But soon he was caught in a neighboring village. The investigation is not disclosing details of the suspect's background. But one local publication noticed that his personal data fully matched Viktor Savinov's, who since 2010 has repeatedly been held accountable for causing grievous bodily harm, theft, car theft, and threats of murder. Robbery and attempted robbery. In 2020, he received 11 years for the murder of a woman committed with particular cruelty. That means he was supposed to be isolated from society until 2031. But taking advantage of Putin's pardon, the hardened criminal committed 2 more serious crimes in a single day. Story 13. The Arsonist. Our next character killed 13 people at once. This unique individual is Stanislav Yonkin, 23 years old. He is a native of the city of Azbest in the Sverdlovsk region, married, father of 2. In the spring of 2022, Stanislav, as a true Russian peacekeeper, signed a contract and went to Ukraine to kill civilians. He didn't serve long, as by fall that year he was already in Crimea being treated for a concussion. Then he was sent to his military unit, which was located in Kostroma. But whether the service wasn't strict or the concussion had its effects, social networks and the media remain silent about this. The fact remains. On November 5, 2022, Sergeant and Medal for Courage recipient Stanislav Yonkin ended up at the Polygon nightclub where he started a fight while drunk. About 15 people took part in it. It should be said that this establishment had long had a bad reputation. Fights and brawls were commonplace there. Stanislav, while drunk, fired a shot from a hunter's signal launcher. Such devices are sold in specialized stores and are used to send signals in extreme conditions in the forest, while hunting or in other situations. But under no circumstances should they be used in public places or indoors, as they are considered a fire hazard or capable of causing injury. That's exactly what happened in our case. The charge fired from the device flew into the ceiling, where there was enough space between the floor slabs for a fire to spread. By the time the clubgoers noticed the danger, it was too late. The ceiling collapsed, and within just a minute, the entire shopping center was engulfed in flames, while the approximately 250 people present rushed to the few exits available. As a result, 13 people died. The person responsible for the tragedy was quickly found and detained. The verdict was delivered almost a year and a half later, in March 2024. Stanislav Yonkin was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security penal colony. In addition, he was ordered to pay the families of the victims 14.5 million rubles and to compensate the building owner for damages in the amount of 45 million rubles. To earn that kind of money, Yonkin intended to go back to the war zone in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were unable to find information on whether the arsonist carried out these plans, but I assume it is quite possible that the killer of 13 people is already free. Story 14. The Gentle Killer and Pedophile. In the context of this story, I want to focus more on the victim of the crime. An 11-year-old resident of Nizhny Tagil, Anastasia Yakina, was a sweet blonde girl, short and slender. She had lost her mother to cancer just a month ago. She lived with her father in a dormitory in an old 5-story building with shabby, dirty walls and holes in the floor. In short, the girl grew up in less than ideal conditions. All this would have evoked sympathy and empathy in a normal person, but not in a hardened criminal who, by a twist of fate, overnight became a hero of the special military operation. On August 30 of this year, Nastya disappeared. Her drunken father informed his neighbor about her disappearance late in the evening. He said that he had allowed his daughter to go for a walk, but she didn't come home, which had never happened before. The neighbor immediately organized a search for the child, but only Nastya's bag and phone were found right under the windows of the house. In the morning, they filed a report with the police. Law enforcement considered several theories. They searched in all possible places. They searched the entire house, even went to the cemetery where the missing girl's mother was buried. It was all in vain. They identified a pool of suspects and even gave the biological father a polygraph test. They interviewed all the residents and learned that Vladimir Alexandrov had unexpectedly left for the special military operation. When they reviewed the security cameras, they saw that this man had carried a large garbage bag into the basement of the building on the day the child disappeared. The police had visited the basement on the very first day of the search, but they didn't inspect it thoroughly because, and please don't laugh, it's really not funny, the basement was flooded with sewage up to their knees. Only after seeing the footage on the security camera did law enforcement call in workers from the management company, who went down into the basement wearing high rubber boots and found the body of 11-year-old Nastya Yakina. This was already September 3rd, the 4th day of the search for the child. The apartment of the suspect in the child's murder, 40-year-old Vladimir Alexandrov, was broken into, and evidence of the child's presence and traces of blood were found there. At the same time, they rushed to pursue the killer and managed to detain him at the very last moment in one of Moscow's airports. To cover his tracks, the pedophile decided to go to war. It is known about Vladimir Alexandrov that he has repeatedly faced criminal charges, including for robbery, assault, fraud, and rape, and involving a minor in committing a crime. The last time he was convicted in 2022 for rape and violent sexual acts. How did he end up free in 2024? I think you can guess that he took advantage of the chance for a pardon by participating in the special military operation. But as we can see, he went back to his old ways. The residents of the ill-fated building don't know much about the criminal. After all, he moved into this dormitory just a few months ago. They weren't alarmed by Alexandrov's stories about recently returning from the special military operation, where he had gone from a penal colony. Everyone knows there are plenty of convicts in the Russian hinterland, and society's attitude towards such individuals is far too lenient. The main thing locals noted was that Alexandrov was polite. He always greeted people, didn't swear, did sports, and loved children very much. He even built a sandbox for the little kids in the yard at his own expense. The local children responded in kind and affectionately called him Uncle Vova. After his arrest, the pedophile confessed to the rape and murder of Anastasia Yakina, which he committed while intoxicated. He said that on that ill-fated day, he came to see Nastya's father, but he wasn't home. The girl opened the door, and he invited her for tea. She agreed. At home, he raped the child and then killed her. He hid the body in the basement. Now Alexandrov is in pre-trial detention. For the murder of a child along with the kidnapping, the detained Vladimir Alexandrov now faces a life sentence. But this will no longer help either the murdered Nastya or her father. Story 15. Repeat offender, teacher of good manners. And the top spot in today's episode goes to Alexander Derzalov. No, not for the sophistication of the crime, but for honesty. Judging by this character's biography, he can confidently be called a true repeat offender. A 30-year-old man has 7 convictions. 7. And almost always for violence, for making death threats, for attempted murder, for causing bodily harm, for using violence against a law enforcement officer. There were also charges for theft and robbery, though. Derzalov received his last sentence in 2021 and he was sent to prison for 4 years. Derzalov signed a contract with Wagner while in prison. And he went to the war zone. For his service, besides a pardon, he received a medal for bravery and the right to be a respected member of society. But it didn't last long. His hometown of Kemerovo did not welcome the newly minted representative of Russia's new elite very warmly, without proper respect. Derzalov had to pick up the knife again and teach people manners. This happened early in the morning, in the fall of 2023. The veteran of the special military operation returned home after spending time at a nightclub, but on the balcony of a neighboring building, 2 men he didn't know for some reason started insulting him. At least, that's what Derzalov thought. And grabbing a knife, he went to the neighboring building. The door to the apartment was unlocked. Inside, besides the offenders themselves, there were also 2 women and 2 children. But this circumstance did not stop the criminal, and he attacked the strangers. He seriously wounded one of them. Fortunately, after the blow, the blade broke off from the handle, and those present managed to restrain the attacker and hand him over to the authorities. While they were on their way to the scene, Alexander Derzalov honestly revealed his true nature and his intentions. I will cut you. I will kill you. I fought for your children. I killed there, and I will kill you too. That's what the subdued criminal shouted. But in court, he did not admit his guilt. He claimed that he just wanted to talk to the guys about their dangerous moral behavior, because if he had wanted to kill, he would have done it. After all, that's exactly what they were taught in the special military operation. The court sentenced the repeat offender to 7 years in prison. But no one can guarantee that in half a year or a year, the aggressive veteran of the special military operation won't end up free again, and won't continue teaching his fellow citizens manners. And unfortunately, these aren't just isolated cases. There are hundreds of such cases, and thousands more are simply never mentioned out of great fear. That's the Russian world, and its heroes. Goodbye, everyone.